Well, it is great to be with you. I have looked forward to this. Last year, I'm going to say a couple things before I get started in the lesson. But last year, I was looking forward to this, and I got sick just before we were able to come up here. It didn't have anything to do with the cancer, but it had to do with the after effects of the cancer. I don't have adrenaline in my body. My adrenal system doesn't function, and I just wasn't able to make it, and I really hated that. But I was able to be asked again to come up this year, and I am so thankful to be here. This is, I spent 21 years in Glasgow, and your faces are familiar, and this is to a great degree home. It is great to see Jack. When I moved here, Jack was here as well as Paul Hodges, and they worked together many years ago. And I'm glad you're able to be here, Jack. You did a lot for this church, and you have done a lot for this community, and continue to through the school and all the things that you have done. And I also have family that showed up here today from West Virginia. They came all the way down here to listen to Andy preach. Anyway, it's good to have them here. And I see folks from South Green where I used to preach, and it's good to be here. And we have been looking forward to this. If you have your Bible, open it to the book of John. And we're going to be looking at the second chapter this morning. And I want to bring out a few points. Maybe it's not so much a sermon presentation as much as it is a Bible class presentation. And you will hear this over and over again. I love the book of John, but that purpose statement of the writing in John chapter 20, you'll probably hear it. I've already heard it this morning by somebody, and then you'll hear it throughout the week. But John is unlike Matthew and Luke in that it wastes no time on genealogies. There's no presentation of the childhood of Jesus. It gets right down to the point. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then he tells us that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. And this book is a book of signs. Jesus over and over again demonstrated that he was the Messiah. And there were a lot of people claiming to be messiahs. They had a string of people who claimed to be the long-awaited Messiah. Well, Jesus comes making the same claim, but he had the signs to back it up. And you get to the end of the book of John, he tells you why he wrote this book and why the information that's in it is in it. He said, many other signs truly did Jesus in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you would have life in his name. Have you ever wished you could go back and man, I wish I could have seen the miracles. Wouldn't you have loved to have been able to live and to see? Like on one occasion in Luke chapter 7, Jesus is just there and he sees a funeral procession going down the road. And it was a widow who lost her only son. And Jesus just tells them to stop, goes up to this procession, stop. And he touches the casket and the man rises out of it. He's alive now. Can you imagine witnessing that? And the joy that would have brought to that woman, she would have been a mess emotionally, would she not have? Don't just read words, but put yourself in the context and imagine what it would have been like to have seen it, to have witnessed it. And he did things like that over and over again throughout. The Bible speaks of signs, wonders, and miracles. We use those words. They all reference the same thing, but they're different aspects of the same thing. A miracle is this supernatural act of God that defies the laws of nature and is something that, God did and empowered some people to do. The word wonders is the reaction that we have to it. When we see it, we're just like blown away. Our jaw drops. Did I just see what I saw? Even the disciples who believed in Jesus and believed he was the Messiah, sometimes after he had performed a miracle, they would say, "Who is this man?" They knew who he was, but they were just amazed, level after level of amazement by the things that they were witnessing. But in the book of John, never once did Jesus mention miracles. They were always signs. Even that passage I just read or quoted to you from John chapter 20, verse 30 and 31, and many other signs did Jesus. Signs are things that try to get your attention. We have this thing where I preach. My secretary and I have this running battle. She puts up signs, I take them down. We're like, I made a little thing. It said a little cartoon. It had a picture of a church and had a church sign out front. And it says, "The Friendly Church." And then I created these little placards all through the park, the property of the church building. It says, "Stay off the grass, no trespassing." And I had all these signs because we have a sign for everything at our church building. And but what Jesus was doing and why it's referred to as signs is because it was a way to point people to him. When you say, use other door, that directs you to the other door. And these signs that Jesus did, these miracles, they were used as signs. Jesus didn't just come to be a do-gooder. He came with these powers to point people to God and to himself. And I know that we can sit, and I do, and I sit and I think, man, I would have loved to have been there and seen him, call forth Lazarus from the tomb and all of these other things. But you know what? I suspect that those first century Christians would say, man, I wish I could live in the 21st century when I had the Word of God in a leather-bound copy that I could carry with me everywhere. And I didn't have bits and pieces, and I didn't have to rely on revelation from somebody else here and there and bits. And you see, I think it all washes out, doesn't it? They were eyewitnesses, but we have testimony of the eyewitnesses, reliable testimony of those eyewitnesses, and we have the fullness of God's revelation that they didn't have as it was just being doled out to them. So there are pros and cons, but I love the idea. You get to chapter 2 in John, and you have two accounts recorded in John chapter 2, one dealing with the wedding feast of Canaan, the other dealing with the first cleansing of the temple that Jesus engaged in. And both of those accounts are signs to the person and the identity of Jesus. And that's the important. Why would we just have this random story about Jesus going to a wedding? Or why would we have this story of maybe the intrigue of Jesus getting angry, making a whip and driving people out of the temple? There's purpose behind that. It's all a part of the plan where John is trying to show you Jesus was the Christ. So let's start with this wedding feast. You know the story. I'm going to summarize it for you. But Jesus, his mother, his disciples were invited to a wedding feast. And while they were there at this feast, they ran low on the wine. And so the mother of Jesus comes to Jesus and says, they're running out of wine. What are you going to do? Do something. And Jesus says, well, it's not my time. And Mary tells the men, just do whatever he tells you. And it's where Jesus turns water into wine. There were 6 water pots that contained about 20 to 30 gallons each. That's a lot of water. And those pots are really big pots, is what I'm trying to say. And those pots were used for washing. They were for clean. If you wanted to describe it as bath water, that's the kind of pots. And Jesus says, dip into that pot and go take it to the master of the wedding feast. Tell him to take a drink. Okay. And so they did, and he said, that's better than what was served first. You don't serve the good stuff second, you serve the good stuff first. Like if you have company over and you're making a bunch of rolls and your first batch comes out and the bottom's burned, but the second batch comes out and it's just fine, what do you serve first? You put the good stuff out first, and if you have to use the lesser, you'll use it. But he says this is all backwards. You've saved the best to last. And so there is a statement in verse 14, or excuse me, in verse 11, it says, this was the beginning of the signs that Jesus did in Cana of Galilee. And he manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. The purpose of those signs was to cause people to believe. And, Andy mentioned about, Nathaniel just a little bit ago being amazed by Jesus just by that one confrontation where Jesus said, I saw you under the tree. And Jesus says, you haven't seen anything yet. There's more to come that, will basically blow your socks off. You won't believe what's going to happen and what you will witness. And this is the beginning of it right here. He turns water to wine. But let's look at some things that exhibit his power and his identity from this passage. And the first thing that I would like for you to see is the timing that is involved in this miracle. In John chapter 2, the mother, verse 3, and when they ran out of wine, the mother of Jesus said to him, they have no wine. And Jesus said to her, woman, what does your concern have to do with me? My hour has not yet come. There are a couple things to unpack there. And we'll just start with the woman statement. Now, I'm telling you, had I walked in my house when I was a boy and said, woman, what's for supper? And I addressed my mother like that, that would not have gone over very well. I would be probably taking cover somewhere. So what do we make about this? Jesus saying to his mother, woman, what's this have to do with me? Some commentators have struggled with this, and they think that it's rather disrespectful. And we know that Jesus never did anything wrong, so how do we harmonize these words with his character, his blamelessness? It sounds like a disrespectful child. But I think if you understand the nature, so many things are cleared up in the incarnation. So many, like, how does God, is Jesus God? Yes. Does God know everything? Yes. Did Jesus know everything? No. He didn't know about the return, the day that was appointed. Well, but it's cleared up in the incarnation. There were certain things that Jesus emptied himself of, prerogatives that he had that he emptied himself of. And this is a statement that I think gets cleared up when you understand who Jesus is. Jesus was Mary's son. And as he dealt with her in that relationship, he was her son. But Jesus was also her creator and her maker. And she wasn't just his mama. She was a woman, a human being, over which he had authority. As a son, Mary had authority over Jesus as he was being raised. But as the creator of the universe, Jesus has authority over her. And I think what he's doing is asserting himself in his identity of being God in the flesh. John 1 and verse 1, in the beginning was with God, the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So when he doesn't say, Mama, now why are you asking me about this? He says, woman. I think Jesus is putting some distance here. He's not Mary's little boy. He is a man on a mission. God put on flesh and dwelling among us, and as God, he addresses her as woman. This is not the right time. This is not the right timing. And you see, I don't see any disrespect in that at all when you take it into that point or consider that point of view. Jesus was not only Mary's son, but she was Mary's creator. And so there's that statement. But then here's the next question that I run into is, okay, if it's not your timing, why'd you go ahead and do it? There is something to say about timing. In Galatians 4 and verse 4, Paul said, in the fullness of time, God sent forth his son, born of a woman. There was a fullness of time. You see, there was, I'll put it in the terms of Robert Milligan. In 1868, Robert Milligan wrote a book entitled The Scheme of Redemption. Some of you who went to college and studied, various Bible classes, you may have used The Scheme of Redemption as a textbook at one point or another. Apart from some premillennial thoughts that he had in it, the book is very good. And what he tries to lay out for us is that before the foundation of the world, God had this grand scheme to bring about man's redemption. Before it ever happened, God knew that man would sin. And so he made provision for it. I'll tell you what, when you start thinking about the scheme of redemption and all the intricacies of that scheme, you will come away with a greater appreciation of the power and the all-knowing wisdom of God. You see, Revelation chapter 13 and verse 8 says that Jesus was a lamb slain from the foundation of the world. Before there was ever an Adam and Eve, Jesus was as good as dead on the cross because it was all a part of God's scheme. And when you start thinking about the details of that, like, okay, this Jesus is going to come into the world and he's going to come in through the Jews, through the tribe of Judah, and every father had to have a succession of sons. That's not you can see family lines die out all the time. And we have thousands of years of everything just happening and all the interactions and all the things that could have threatened his life but didn't, everything just, God didn't make everybody, he didn't take away our free will. He didn't make everybody do the right thing to make Jesus come. But what he did do was he knew. Being able to see the end from the beginning, he planned it and wove it all out throughout human history. And Jesus arrives just at the right time. And that brings another question to mind. Why then? Why not all right, Adam and Eve sin, they're in the garden, 5 minutes later, Jesus shows up. And why not then? Why did we have to wait all that time and come in the first century? I don't know the answer to all those questions. I can give you some things that I would think made the first century an optimal time, but at the end of the day, it's speculation. I don't have insight into the mind of God, but here's what I do know. It was the fullness of time. An inspired man said that was the perfect time for Jesus to come into the world and die. And so when Mary says, I want you to perform this miracle or help them in some way, Jesus says, it's not my time. I'm not ready to reveal myself. Do you remember there were several times when Jesus, out of compassion, would heal somebody and then say, don't tell anybody? Do you remember that? That would have been the hardest thing in the world to have done, right? And sometimes people who were told not to tell went ahead and told. I think I'd be too afraid to do that. Maybe he would revoke it if I didn't listen to what he said. But again, that all has to do with that timing aspect. Don't reveal it. My time has not yet come. I'll heal you because I love you and I'll have compassion on you, and it'll convince you that I am who I claim to be. But don't spread the word yet. There's a time. I don't want things to gain momentum before time and have this thing all, mess up. So Jesus goes ahead and does it, though, even though it wasn't according to his time. How do we explain that? Well, I think the key is that not many people knew what had taken place. Oh, those who filled the water pots, the few servants that would have done that, they would have been aware. And the disciples of Jesus were aware. But it says nothing about the guests knowing. And even the master of the wedding didn't even know, like, what's the deal here? And he didn't even know what had happened. And so I think Jesus said, while it's not my time to fully reveal myself yet, I will acquiesce and grant you this and do this. And it was done in a semi-private way where people didn't know. But the second thing that I would like for us to look at is that not only do we see the timing of this miracle and the power that Jesus has, but I want you to see the passion or the compassion of Jesus. Why spend a miracle at a wedding feast? I mean, I see the woman who was walking in the funeral procession with her dead son. I see doing that. I see some of the miracles of people who were lame and crippled and blind and could not see and who had died and left their families grieving. I can see those purposes, but running out of something to drink at a wedding, that doesn't seem high priority. But I think it was to the family who was getting married. And I see a lesson about the compassion of Jesus here. Is God too busy for your little troubles in this world? Will he involve himself in your concerns? Absolutely. Peter said that we're to cast our cares upon him, for he cares for us. And I think this is one of those examples. Isaiah said that we're not to fear. He said, "Fear not, for I'm with you." And he said, "And I will help you." Call out to God. When you find yourself distressed, hurting, confused, God is not so busy with holding the world together that he cannot get involved in your particular affairs, as he did here in John chapter 2. A wedding. The protocol, the etiquette is going to be a little off at this wedding. Some people will be a little embarrassed. We're talking about a level of embarrassment and shame. We're not talking about life and death. But God took note of even those smaller matters in life, and he will in yours as well. Let God reach out to you. And I think something else about this passage is the reaction. It's a great example of faith and works combined, and that's how we're saved today. That statement of Mary, do you remember what she said? Verse 5. Whatever he says to you, do it. That's probably the wisest thing. If you were to try to find a nutshell of the wisest verse in the Bible, that would be my choice. Whatever he says, do it. I can't think of any better advice spoken by anybody who has ever lived. Follow Jesus. And so she says this to the servants, and here's what Jesus said to them. Go fill these things up to the brim. You know, they'd probably been down, people washing and getting ceremonially clean. And he says, fill these water pots back up to the brim. And then I want you to dip in, and I want you to take that to the master of the feast and tell him to take a drink. Now, I can think of a lot of reasons why, as a servant, you wouldn't want to do that. You what? You want me to take this bath water and take this to the... People have washed their hands in that. This is nasty water. I don't know if I want to do that or not. I'll get in trouble. You know, if he drinks that and spits it out, and then, what are you doing to me trying to, no. You see, there are reasons why that servant could have said, not me, But Mary had just said, whatever he says, do it. And so you have this combination of faith, and they had to do something, right? They had to take it. So you have the faith and the action combined together that we see that mirrors our salvation. You may not understand why are we saved in the way we are saved? Why a cross? Why do we have to be baptized? Why couldn't there have been some other way? You know what? You can wonder about that forever. But at the end of the day, here's what I want you to do. Trust Jesus. Here's what he said. Now let's obey it. Let's do it. I don't understand all the complexities of the cross and the substitutional atonement of Jesus and all that, but I know it's true, and it happened, and it was satisfactory to God. And why couldn't God have given an angel, or why couldn't God have done something? I don't know all the answers to all those questions, but what I do know is the sacrifice of Jesus was sufficient to allow God to be just and the justifier of men. I trust that. And so I do it, and I don't argue with it. And so we have that lesson taught here as well. And now let's go on to the second part of this lesson. And right after this wedding feast, it was the Passover, and Jesus goes into Jerusalem. And during Passover, there are thousands and thousands of people who have come back to Jerusalem. It's one of those times when all the men would come back to Jerusalem. And so he goes in the temple, and he finds oxen and sheep and dove, and they're all being exchanged in the temple. And it infuriates him. And he makes a whip, and he drives out the money changers, and he drives out the animals, and he says, you will not make my Father's house, well, this passage, a house of merchandise, or a den of thieves, in another passage. The disciples then remembered a passage from the Old Testament Psalms when they witnessed that. And it leads us to a couple lessons that I want to present. First of all, we probably need to understand a little bit of the background. The temple was the place of worship, and there were several segments within that temple. There were several areas, like where the priests could be and where the Jewish men could be. There was a court of women. There was even a court for lepers, and there was a court for Gentiles. And they had all of these different areas where people could come together, and it was a place of worship, just like this place. This is a place where we gather together, and we worship, and we pray, and we sing. And we praise God, and that's what the temple was. And these people would come from long distances to offer sacrifices to God, and they would bring their animals maybe, or maybe they would leave them at home because it was such a long distance, and they just buy something when they get there. Well, you had to have temple currency. Like, have you ever been to Canada or some other country, and your dollar doesn't work anymore? You have to exchange that money. And so they were having to exchange their money, their currency, from wherever they came from to the temple currency. apparently, why Jesus called them a den of thieves elsewhere, they must have been ripping people off in the exchange. They weren't, well, your money isn't as valuable as ours, so that dollar you gave me, I'll give you 85 cents for it. You see, those kinds of things were going on. But not only that, they were doing it inside the temple. This is a place of, can you imagine trying to worship God today, and we got this little setup, or we removed the first 6 pews, and we have a bunch of bleating sheep over here, and guys making deals, transactions, talking, while we're trying to worship and give our attention to God. That would be absurd. And that's what they were doing in the house of God. It was probably done in the Gentile court. That's the outer court. We don't really care a whole lot about the Gentiles anyway, so, we'll do these transactions and they'll just have to get over it. Maybe that was their thinking. But Jesus took this distraction of worship very seriously. This is a place where people come and worship God, and they were making a mockery of worship by the distraction of all of this. And so Jesus overturns the tables, runs everybody out, and proclaims, my Father's house will not be made a house of merchandise. When you look at that passage, there are several things to note as we see this here. First of all, there's this distraction to worship. We don't have sheep distracting us today, but we still struggle with the same thing. Do you have something in your pocket that sometimes goes off? How many, I remember the first time I'd had a cell phone, and but I called somebody. He was a missionary in another country, and he said, just a minute, I'm in Walmart. And what do you mean you're in Walmart? I didn't understand the concept that he could have been in Walmart on a cellular phone. But those things have become such a distraction to our worship. We have to put signs up. We have to make announcements. Turn your cell phones off. I think of that. It's not just a matter of social etiquette. It's a matter that we need to view more seriously, really. This distraction that was taking place as people were trying to worship riled Jesus. And he said, this has got to stop. And we need to, not just cell phones, but how about going in and out 40 times? When I was a child, we made preparation for worship in my house. Chili Billy was on at 11:30. I don't know if any of you from up north, but Chili Billy was a program out of Pittsburgh, and it had one of those B-quality scary movies, and I always wanted to watch it. News was on, and then when the news went off, Chili Billy came on, and my parents would say, no, you can't stay up. Why? Because we have an appointment with God tomorrow, and you need to get your sleep. I didn't appreciate it at the time, but I really appreciate, and every Saturday night, they would check my class book too. We had class books we brought home for the lesson that we were to study the week ahead, and I wasn't going to church without having done my lesson for the week ahead. But there's this priority to worship, and I don't know that we do that. Like, have your kids go to the restroom before. I know there are times when you can't help things, and there are things that you have to do, phone calls you have to take, emergencies and all. I understand all of that. I'm not saying a word about that. But when one child gets up and runs out 3 or 4 times, there's something more that needs to be taught. I find it interesting that when we pray, a person may be walking down the aisle and then a prayer starts. What do? They stop dead in their tracks. But then when we preach, 4 lanes. And I have wondered, could it be that we show more respect when we're asking God for things and when we're telling something to God, and less respect when God's talking to us? I wonder if there's something behind that. But anyway, Jesus was taken back by this, and he overturns the table. And I want you to notice something else that he says here. What time do I have? This thing still says 39:58, so I've got like quite a bit of time left. 2 minutes? Okay. They brought the bouncer in. All right, well, look at this, verse 16. Take these things away and do not make my Father's house a house of merchandise. Notice again, Jesus standing back. He didn't say, don't make our Father's house. He said, my Father's house. You see, he's deity, and he sustains a relationship to the Father that none of us have. He taught us to pray, our Father who art in heaven, but he addresses him as my Father here. And it's for that sometimes he got in trouble because he talked about that special relationship that he had with God. And they question his authority. Who do you think you are doing this? You give me some credentials. You've just driven out the people and turned over the money tables. And his answer was this: here's my sign, the resurrection. The resurrection is the most powerful sign that attests to the person and the identity of Jesus. And don't let people shake your faith, because that tomb was empty. And that will forevermore settle his identity. Even the brothers of Jesus did not believe he was the Christ, but after the resurrection, they're right there on the day of Pentecost. And Jude and James wrote books of the Bible for us, and they were his brothers. Unbelievers before, but believers afterward. So I hope that as we examine the life of Jesus, we stand in awe of him. Look at the power, the signs that Jesus did on every page in the book of John. And we have 2 of them in John chapter 2 that all attest to his identity. I appreciate your attention.